Welcome to Open Heart Discussions. Today, we're so lucky to have Caleb Matthews here with us to talk about his work in the therapy world. He has a lot of experience and credentials that he'll tell us about here in a second. But again, we're just so lucky to have you here, Caleb. Thanks for coming on my little show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. So as you were saying, I'm Caleb Matthews. I am a licensed professional counselor as well as a licensed marriage and family therapist here in the Austin area. I went to St. Edward's for my master's degree and got my master's in counseling there. And before that, Texas A&M for undergraduate in psychology. So I've been doing this for a few years now. I've been at a few different agencies around town, whether it's Out Youth or Bluebonnet or Integral Care. So I've seen the agency side, and now I'm in private practice. I'm actually starting my own place right now. So that's something really exciting. So I've kind of seen a lot of different facets of therapy. I've worked at Austin State Hospital. I've IOP in the area as well. So seen a lot of different things so that way I could kind of pick which one I liked best. And I love working with individuals, couples, families, mostly working with the LGBT community, and then also working with trauma. I'm an EMDR therapist as well. So that's a lot about me.
Wow.
Right from the get-go.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's so many qualifications, credentials. I know that sounds like that's taken a lot of time to create all that work or get all of those things. So congrats to you as well on your private practice. That often can be such a scary thing for clinicians to do on their own. But once you do and you get settled, it's really a wonderful thing. So I'm happy that you're able to make that jump right now.
Yeah, I'm so excited about it.
Good. So you did tell us a bit about your professional journey. Is there anything that you've done in the past that you really like the most, or say the work that stands out to you?
Yeah, so if I had to narrow it down, I guess as I was just saying, like the three that I would narrow it down to, I love working with couples and families. I love working with the LGBT community, and I love working with trauma. And I've gotten to do that quite a bit here in Austin. One of the organizations that I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that I haven't mentioned yet is called the Human Empathy Project, which is an organization that started here in Austin. It's a local nonprofit. I'm currently the president of it. But what it works to do is foster empathetic communication between the LGBT community and the Christian community. And so kind of if you saw a Venn diagram of the LGBT community and the Christian community, we're working at that intersection where they overlap to kind of see, and pretty much across that whole Venn diagram, because there's people that come in that are Christian and are not super affirming of the LGBT community, or vice versa, where you have the LGBT community that's maybe been hurt by the Christian community, or just does not want anything to do with the Christian community. So just trying to give everybody an empathetic space to exist in. But I'm sure we'll talk more about them as we go along.
Yeah, that's wonderful to be able, like I was imagining you kind of putting the diagram here. They are sometimes in a lot of eyes so polar opposite. And I think that's wonderful that you're bridging the two. I've been to one of the workshops that y'all have given, and I think it was incredible. And I really hope that you get to do a lot more of that. I refer people to it all the time. I think it's wonderful. Well, tell us, I mean, and again, super important that you do couples work. Not a lot of people like to do that couples and family work. As a therapist, I'm an individual therapist, and you mentioned couples, and I'm like, no, so happy.
I love couples work. It's one of my favorite things to do. I really took it up whenever I was in graduate school. I went to a program that had a dual licensure, and so you could get your LPC and your LMFT at the same time. And I just totally gravitated towards the idea that people exist more in systems than they do on their own. And so as much as I love doing individual work, couples is just so much more dynamic. And I feel like you can see change so much quicker in a couples session because they're both in the room. It's not like, oh, let me know how that goes this week whenever you go and talk with them. It's like, nope, they're here and you're talking right to them. So
Right.
I love that piece of it.
And how important and great that is that you have that for the LGBT community as well. I can understand too that while there will be therapists that are well versed in that, it also, people really like the idea of being able to go to someone who they feel more understands, like really can relate in ways. Yeah, so can you speak more to that about like why you're so passionate about working with that population?
Yeah, I feel like, as you said, I think that there needs to be a certain familiarity for people that are in the LGBT community. There's just certain things that maybe pop up that might not make as much sense to somebody that's outside of the LGBT community. I'm not saying that if you're outside of the LGBT community that you wouldn't be able to work with an LGBT couple, but being someone that is a part of the LGBT community can definitely provide just a certain edge to counseling. I'm thinking about how couples might come in and start talking about what it was like to grow up, or that perfectionism, or that rage, that anger that gets talked about in books like The Velvet Rage by Alan Downs. Like, there are certain familiarities that you can read about. I highly recommend that you do read about that, especially if you're an ally. But whenever you've experienced it yourself, that can be so much more helpful, I think, because it comes from that place of, yeah, I get what you're saying and I understand where you're coming from. So that's one of the things that drew me to working with LGBT couples, is that I understand that piece of it a little bit more, because I've experienced it myself. And so that's what I love about working with LGBT couples.
And thank you too for sharing that piece of yourself on our little interview here. Why do you think then, and this will flow right into what you're talking about, but so I can ask the question of why is mental health awareness so important to that population in particular, to the folks that you work with?
Yeah, so I think mental health, I think, is going to be important to anyone, but especially with the LGBT community, there's this sense of identity that is rooted for the LGBT community. Because at some point in your life, if you're a part of the community, you're going to have this coming out process where you reveal this identity to other people. And that can be really hard because people might think like, oh, this is who you are now. For example, I'll give myself an example. I'm Catholic, and I'm also a gay man. So whenever I came out, people assumed like, oh, so you're not Catholic anymore. And it's like, no, that's still a part of my identity. And so there's lots of different flavors of being gay or being lesbian or being trans that are out there. And so being able to have a place to process that and be like, what does this say about who I am? Does it change any of my ideas or my beliefs or my values to come out in this way? The LGBT community luckily has a process where they reach a certain age or they reach a certain time in their life where it's like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to come out, or not. And they get to kind of grapple with that identity piece in a way that I think straight people, I wish that they almost had this opportunity to kind of gear up their identity and figure out who they are in this way. Because I mean, it's one of those, I'm just picturing back in graduate school, sitting through and hearing that identity versus role confusion, Eric Erickson sort of stage, where you're grappling with who am I as a person. And that's what I really like to work with in therapy, is helping people figure out, like, who am I? What's some self-awareness that I can gain from looking into myself?
Right. And great, because I know that so many people do struggle with that, and even their coming out may just be coming out to themselves.
Yeah.
That, right? And there's still so much confusion for a lot of people outside the community, within the community as well, of course, but the people outside not understanding each of the letters that represent those. And I think about bisexual identity, and oftentimes that, like, oh, well, I thought you were a lesbian. You're a lesbian last week, but you're marrying a man. So that
Yeah.
now, like, what's going on? Just like, no, not fair. That's not part of your identity. Or that's not, you don't get to just throw it at someone like that and assume their identity for them. Right?
I think you bring up such a good point, especially with bisexuality, because yeah, you're exactly right. Like, oh, after you get married, does that mean that you're just no longer bisexual anymore? Like, you picked a side?
Yeah.
Well, that's not what that means. Like, if you're on that Kinsey scale and you're at a 3, like, you're still a 3 the day that you marry your husband, and then you're like, I mean, that bisexuality piece is still a piece of your identity, even whenever you pick up different pieces as well.
And for those of you who are not familiar with what Caleb's talking about, it's just that we have this fluidity, and there's this scale that's often used, and you could probably speak way more to it than I can more eloquently about, but we have this fluidity in our sexuality, and the Kinsey scale can be like a place where you say, oh, I fall this or there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for pointing out my that I didn't explain that. But yeah, so the Kinsey scale is a scale from 0 to 6, where someone can kind of identify themselves on this idea of a spectrum. So much like the DSM, a lot of things are on a spectrum there. The book that we use to diagnose, Kinsey, many years ago, came up with a scale where he said, if you're completely heterosexual, no homosexual feelings whatsoever, you're a 0 on the Kinsey scale. And if you're completely homosexual, you're a 6 on the Kinsey scale. And then that there's gradations in between, which was a really important thing, because whenever this was first getting talked about, people were saying you're either straight or you're gay. And this finally allowed for not only bisexuality in the middle, but a gradient in the middle, where it's like, I'm attracted to these people romantically, or I'm attracted to these people sexually. There's so much that's grown from Kinsey's work.
Yes.
That I just love nerding out over. So
yeah,
I'm glad that we're getting to talk about this.
So much more that goes into it than just sexual preference, or just that, you know, sexuality piece. So I know you and I, we definitely could talk about that all day, and, you know, in trans being to another population that is part of the community, but still its own separate identity, different from just sexual orientation. There's that gender piece to it. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, if that's something, or you feel you're more.
Yeah, no, I absolutely would love to speak about that. That's a great segue, because it was exactly where my mind was going as well. The trans community, there's so many good resources out there, but one that I'd highly recommend just looking up, because I'm very visual, and so an image that might be helpful for people if you're watching this is to look up the genderbread person or the genderbread unicorn. And so hopefully I can send you over some information about that after we finish today. But what it is it puts everything kind of on a spectrum, whether that's masculinity, femininity, or how you express your gender versus your gender identity. There's just lots of different ways that you can express yourself. And something that I really value about the genderbread person is, rather than what Kinsey did, where you start at 0 and go to 6, so it's one scale, the genderbread person even flipped that a little bit on its head and started to say that you go from 0 to 100 for masculinity, but then there's also a femininity scale. So you can be 100% at both masculinity and 100% at femininity, and that's who you are as a person. You don't have to reduce one to increase the other, which, like I said, this might be something that would be easier to look at and perceive if you're looking at a picture. So if you're watching this, Google the genderbread person, and that'll be a nice visual for you.
And later at the end, we're definitely going to talk about ways that people can contact you and reach you. So if they ever wanted to talk about it more and learn it, then they can certainly do that. Is there anything else you want to say about the importance of your work with the LGBT community or other populations that are discriminated against, and your work as a couples therapist or as a trauma therapist?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess some of the stuff that I want to just be out there is, I don't know, I was trying to think about this because Lacey, you're excellent at hosting this. I got these questions days ago, and so I got time to think about them. And one of the most powerful images that I've heard was at a conference that I went to where we talked about holding space with different people that are different than us, and how do we do that? And the person who was speaking gave this metaphor, and anytime that you give metaphors, it's a tricky business because no metaphor is perfect. But this one really stuck out to me. And what he said was that, and this is something I think about whenever I work with the Human Empathy Project, the LGBT community and the Christian community, bringing those together. He brought up that there's this idea of an estuary, and I had to look up what an estuary was after he said this, but an estuary is a place where both saltwater and freshwater fish can survive. And so the saltwater, the ocean life can live here, as well as people like fish that are from rivers. And so what does this relate to counseling? That's the kind of space that I want to create with counseling and with the Human Empathy Project, is a space where both people with different ideals and values can exist in the same space. And one of the remarkable things about this metaphor is it's not trying to force either fish to go to the other place, but if a fish lives in an estuary long enough, they're able at that point to make a choice. So from living in an estuary, a fish can decide like, oh, this, I actually want to head towards the ocean. And they'd be able to survive in the ocean after living in the estuary for a certain amount of time. Or they can decide to just continue to live in the estuary, or they can decide to go back to the river where it might be a little bit more safe for them. So being able to create a space that is beautifully welcoming to everyone, so that way all ideas can be heard. That's what I seek to do with counseling, and that's what I seek to do with the Human Empathy Project.
Oh, that's wonderful. I see that, and we hear this all the time in counseling, is meeting people where they are, right? Because that's what they need. That's just exactly where they are. And I see you being able to provide that space for them, that validation for them. And with the Human Empathy Project, can you tell us more about the roots of that? I know it's super important to you, but how did you get involved with that? How did you learn about it, and how did things get created the way they are now?
Yeah, good questions. So the Human Empathy Project, local nonprofit, started, I think 2012, 2013. Gonna need to look that up after this. But yeah, so it got started a few years ago by Jenna Minix, who's amazing and also a counselor here. And she also works at Seminary of the Southwest, which is has an LPC program in Austin as well. Highly recommend looking into Jenna. But she got started because she had a experience with the LGBT community where she started writing her dissertation about the LGBT community and Christian community and how there's kind of a divide between the two. And so she wanted to bring them together. And how she started doing that was, it started out by just having dinners where people would discuss, and they had certain rules that you followed to make sure that everybody was feeling respected and safe. And she wrote this beautiful dissertation that I'm going to absolutely butcher right now. But I'm going to try to explain one of the main concepts of it, which is that empathy flows best whenever it flows from a place of privilege and power to a place of less privilege and less power. And so that's the way that empathy flows best, is whenever it's flowing downhill. And anytime that empathy is flowing in the other direction, what Jenna would say is that it's being extremely generous. And so what that means is that maybe if you're a minority, whether that's part of BIPOC or the LGBT community, and you're speaking to the Christian community or another community, that's going to be a lot more difficult being in the minority stance. And so it names that, which I think is beautiful. And it says like, that's being extremely generous. Like that the person that's in the minority role shouldn't have the responsibility for all of the empathy that needs to be gathered. And so they started having these conversations where it started to increase trust because people were bringing their vulnerability and it was getting matched with respect and dignity. And so they saw that they were really making a change with these dinners, and it eventually turned into the Human Empathy Project, where now we hold consultations that are confidential for pastors and members of the LGBT community, parents of the LGBT community. If you have any questions and feel any affiliation towards them, you can reach out and get a consultation. And that's something that's completely free. We also offer workshops, like Lacey was saying earlier, for counselors, social workers. We've done that before as well. And we offer those for community members too. So you don't have to be somebody that necessarily works with this population as a counselor to know more or learn more. And that's something it's just really near and dear to my heart, because it's, I guess how I got affiliated with it was I joined after I went to a conference, and I kept telling people that I'm a Catholic gay man, and people were like, you need to talk to Jenna. And so I spoke to her, and she told me about this organization. I was like, yes, that sounds amazing. And since then I've gotten to be a much bigger role in this in this organization, and am now the president. So
Yes.
I am loving getting to do the work that I do, and everybody that's on our board is absolutely incredible. So I just love getting to be a part of this, because it speaks to a part of me that's just very special to me.
Yeah, I understand that completely. Being able to serve on a board for something that you're really passionate about, and your ways of relating and connecting, or just, again, serving that back to people who that you can say like, wow, that's really important to me because I've experienced it. I know. So that's incredible. Let's see. I wanted, and one thing I wanted to say is I love that the analogy you talked about, the empathy going down, is so great because it applies to so many populations, like you said, for the BIPOC community as well. And that's something that, we always definitely have to keep in mind as people, and especially as therapists and white therapists, or any therapist that may be straight, a white ally or a straight ally, keeping those things in mind. Is there anything, I'm going to ask you this question, kind of both of them together. Is there anything that you would like other professionals in your field to know? And is there anything that you would like your clients or other people in the public to know, just based on the conversation that we've had today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one of the things to make sure that you know before you head into any sort of conversation with the LGBT community, or pretty much anyone, you want to make sure that your definitions are the same. um, I want to explain that a little bit better. What I mean by that is, and I'm going to give an example, is that let's say you're a parent talking to your child about what it means to be gay. Firstly, it's most helpful to define, well, what do we mean by gay? Because mom might be meaning, oh, the actions that you take. So what you decide to do with another man, like that's what I'm talking about, the actions that you take. Whereas the child might be thinking to themselves like, oh, I'm talking about the attraction that I feel. And so those are two completely different things. And if you're trying to have a conversation and you're not even talking about the same thing, that's not going to go well. And so it's really important that you make sure you're defining something correctly, because once you're both talking about attractions, or maybe once you're both talking about actions, you might have different understandings. Because like, for example, with the gay community, research has been done, and I can give you pages and pages on the fact that attraction, that's not something that can change. In fact, conversion therapy, you're 8 times more likely to try to attempt suicide after undergoing that. You're more likely to experience drug use, HIV, STDs are more likely. And so I could go into all of that, but attraction's not something that can change. Actions, that's something that can change. And for some people, they decide to be celibate after this, or they decide that they want to be in a relationship and that's okay. But that's something to kind of process through. And so I guess that's one of the main things that I want to make sure people know. I know I got really specific in an example, but yeah, just make sure that your definitions are on the same page before you start diving into deep conversations, because if you're defining things differently, you're not going to get anywhere.
And that's such an important point too, with any of the work that we're doing, like you said, with anyone in the LGBT community and the BIPOC community, is really having that conversation, but doing your own work first too, really taking the time to understand, to learn what you can on your own, and then moving forward with it, because you've got to have some knowledge around this stuff, or like you said, it's going to make for some very, very awkward conversations if you don't have it. So.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think you're bringing up yet another good point that I like to think about, and I explain to people, is the idea of Johari's window. So Johari's window talks about that there are certain things that we know and certain things that maybe we don't know, but we know our ignorance. And then there's sometimes that we have something that's completely within our blind spot. And so I think that can be really tricky with talking with the LGBT community or talking with the BIPOC community, whenever someone goes into those conversations, because if you have a lot in your blind spot, you don't even know what you don't know. Right. And that's really, really tricky. So that's, I think, why, to me at least, your comment of make sure you're doing your own work is extremely important, because you got to figure out if there's stuff that's in that blind spot before you're really ready to go do some work.
Oh, great point to you. So point for Lacey, point for Caleb. We're doing
yeah. Talking about this.
I want to ask you, are there any other resources that you would recommend for people in the community, and yourself, follow that up with you being a great resource? How can people contact you?
Yeah, so ways that you can contact me. You can contact me at my number, which is 844-912-1643. Or you can contact me by email at cmatthews@nrtfc.com. I highly recommend, if I know that I'm mainly speaking about the Human Empathy Project, and I'm also speaking a lot about the LGBT community, and the Christian community. If you're looking for resources on any of that, highly recommend going to the Human Empathy Project's website, which is thehumanempathyproject.com. One of the things that is listed there is a resource page. So it's going to connect you to different churches in the area that you can go to. It's going to connect you to Out Youth and Waterloo Counseling Center, other places in the community that LGBT people can find resources. Or if you're a pastor and you want to consult, you're able to do that at the website as well. One of the resources that I always can't recommend highly enough is called Church Clarity. Church Clarity is a website where you can look up to see what a church's values are. So that way you stepping into the church isn't the first time that you're figuring out, are they okay with the fact that I have a husband, or are they okay with the fact that we have adopted kids? You can look into their values beforehand. So that's, I think, a really good resource for people that are maybe bridging that as well. But that's all listed, like I said, on the Human Empathy Project's website. Other resources, like we mentioned earlier, the Genderbread Person. I'm a big resource person, and so as Lacey definitely knows, any type of training or anything that we go to, I'm gonna find all the resources and put them in some sort of document before the end of the training happens. So
what's great is he'll share it with you as well, and it's so helpful.
Yeah, that's actually I think one of the ways that we met, because we met at doing the EMDR project.
Yes.
And, I could tell how studious you were as well, so I was like, let me go be friends.
Yes, and then we were like, well, let's just go have lunch, and the rest is history. And we've done some more EMDR trainings together, and that's why when I started this project, I was just so happy. I was thinking Caleb will be wonderful to talk to. So, do you have an Instagram page or any?
No Instagram page, no
Okay.
social media stuff currently, but be on the lookout. I'll get you some more of my information as it's coming up, and maybe we can put it in the comment section or something.
So yeah, because I'm excited to see more about your practice when it's getting ready to go. So if there's anything I missed or anything else you want to comment on, please let me know.
Yeah, I think that's it for me. I've loved getting to I guess talk with you today, and I'd love to, if you ever want to do a panel with more people or anything like that. This is excellent, and I love that
that's a great
you're
idea.
doing this for the community. So I'd be happy to help out any way that I can.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So one day I will work on that, and I will ask you to help me out with it, and we'll get it going. Okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. It was so great to talk to you today.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Bye.